Hey everyone, Reaper here again with another video. This time I wanted to talk a little bit about how I feel about date stamps. Now, before I get to that, maybe I should better prepare myself for speaking to people. What do you think? Feel safer? This was actually made by Patrick's wife, Lori, and these were sent down. I got mine about a week ago. Thank you so much for this. This is so awesome. I wear this now when I go out. Whenever I go out, when I rarely leave the house now, as we are pretty much under a lot of places we can't go, except for food stores and other places that are necessary. And I wear this. This is definitely one of the more unique masks I've seen, and I'm very, very grateful I have it. Thank you so much, Lori. Thank you, Patrick. So, let's talk a little about date stamps. I used to hate date stamps. When I first came back to the hobby, I didn't have that much experience with seeing date stamps because I had a relatively small collection. The date stamps appeared on Golden Age, Silver Age, and Bronze Age books. I don't think they appeared on Copper Age books. I don't think. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. So when I came back and I started seeing them, I'm like, oh, I don't know if I like those. But as time went on, it took me about a good couple of years, maybe 2 years, to really appreciate the date stamp when I came back to collecting. But as I try to reflect on things. I consider myself a reflective person. So when I started seeing the date stamps, realizing that it is part of comic book history to see date stamps on there, and trying to put myself into the place of when these books came out, for instance, in the 60s. What was going on at that time in the 60s? Even though the book is from the 60s, just seeing that date stamp on it, someone physically put that date stamp, put the stamp right onto the book, makes it more reality for me. So that's some of the things I think about when it comes to the date stamp. So let me just show you a few. I have some that are, pretty cool, but I have others. But these are the ones I pulled out. Here's a Brave and the Bold. Which one is this? 78, the July issue. We know didn't really come out in July. How do we know? Well, we know that DC put books out 2 months before the actual date on the cover, but the date stamp proves it. This came out April 25th, 1968. So what was going on in 1968? I may not know exactly what was going on in April 1968 unless I look it up right now. But in 1968, we had the Vietnam War. A lot of young men were afraid that they were going to be drafted. A lot of young men were drafted to go fight in that war. There were assassinations throughout 1968. And I think at the end of 1968, was that... Which Apollo mission was 1968? It was one where they went successfully, I think, around the moon. They didn't do the moon landing until July 1969. I think that was it, where they successfully went around the moon for, at least the United States did. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. But those are some of the things that were going on. I can't really put myself into the feet of those who lived in the 60s, who experienced all the things that were going on. But when I pick up things that came from the 60s, like comics, and I see the date stamps on them, I try to do it as much as I can, try to understand what was going on. And that's what the date stamp really has been doing for me when I see them on comics, as I've given it more thought. And as we know, the date stamps I think we most know, date stamps don't affect the grade of comics. It's just your preference. There are date stamps and there are store stamps. I preferably like date stamps. I don't mind store stamps as long as they don't cover like large portions of the comic and don't cover people's faces. Sometimes position of the date stamp or the stamp in general makes a big difference for me. Here's another book. Now, I didn't show this book in a comic book haul yet because it's an upgrade. But I upgraded my Tales from the Crypt 37 to a nice mid-grade copy, really cool. But this time the date stamp's a little different, and it's on the back cover. Again, this actually came out 2 months before the actual print date on the cover. This is of August, September. So this came out June 10th. No, excuse me. No, not June 10th. Or maybe it is. It says June 10 p.m. Now, it could mean that it came out 10 p.m. Maybe it came on a late shipment that was going to be distributed in the morning by the newsstand or by the store. Or it could actually be June 10th in the evening. I don't know. That I don't know. That just came to me. I was thinking that it was actually 10 p.m., but it could actually be the actual date, and it came out in the evening. This book came out in 1953, by the way. This is one of the date stamps that doesn't have the year on it, and you'll see that. There are many different date stamps out there, many different identification stamps that were put on these books. As you know, or at least I think you know, there were no comic book stores per se in the 50s and the 60s. I think comic book stores started to become a big thing in the 70s and obviously the 80s. So these books, whenever comics came out, they were on newsstands outside, or they were in drugstores or other types of stores where you could that would take comics and other little things like other big things like newspapers and magazines and all that. Here's another book I'd like to show. And this was the book, this was probably one of the first books I bought with the date stamp. This is when I started saying to myself, okay, maybe the date stamp is not such a big deal. This was the book that I first bought when I started having that attitude. This was my upgrade. This is probably a 7.5 copy of Amazing Spider-Man 101. My original copy, which I sold off, was like a 2.5. But anyway, the date stamp, I think, is perfectly placed on the moon. Not across Morbius's face or anything like that. Maybe it would have been nicer if it was actually across the banister here of the staircase, but whatever. This again with Marvel. Marvel usually released, but it says October, but I think the books actually came out 2.5 to 3 months beforehand. It's July 14th. Came out in 1971, but the 1971 or whatever that is, you can't really see. It's a bit smudged, so I don't know. But again, another good example of a book, pretty cool book too, that has a date stamp. And my last example right here, I'll end this video with another date stamp example of the first appearance of Doctor Strange. Strange Tales 110, as maybe you really can't see because of the glare, right over here. There's a date stamp. Now this book says July in 1963. It actually came out in April of 1963, or at least that's what the date stamp says. Let me see here. It says April 3rd. April 3rd, 1963. Well, it doesn't say 1963. We know it came out in 63, but it says April 3rd. Another cool book. Again, with the 60s, 1963. What was going on in 1963? JFK was the president. He was assassinated in November. But at least when it comes to comics, a lot of things were coming out in 1963. In April 1963, well, not in April 1963, also in 1963, the X-Men came out. Some early issues of Spider-Man came out. Actually, #1 came out, I think, probably in January 1963, even though I think the cover date, I think, is March 1963, I think. Yeah, I think I'm right on that one. But again, Marvel was doing really well in 1963, releasing all these different books. So when I see the date stamp again, it brings me back to that time. What was going on in the country, maybe what was going on in the world, what was going on in comics, what was coming out alongside some of these books. Just seeing the date stamp there tends to make it more real. Even though the book actually comes from those times, when you see the date stamp where somebody actually had to press it down on the book, it makes it more real for me. So what about you? Do you prefer date stamps? Do you like date stamps in certain spots? Do you not care where date stamps are? Do you not buy books with date stamps? What about store stamps? What are your opinions on date stamps? I'd be interested in reading about them. Thank you all for watching, and stay safe.